ago and maybe about 5 or 6 years ago. The names, when I started working, the names of the people who were working in this field were people like Alice LaViolette and people like Bob Geffner. So it's really special for us, Bob, Dr. Geffner, to have you here with us this morning, and Ellen too. Shout out to Ellen. She's not just his tag along, she's the reason he's here. So Ellen, thank you so much for coming. And Dr. Bob Geffner, we're so honored and grateful that you're here this morning. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Bob Geffner. Phones on silent. Thank you.
It's a pleasure to be back. Can you hear me with this? Doesn't seem like this is doing much unless I go like this. Okay. So this will be my breakfast, eating the mic. You all should have gotten this in your table there. Did you all fill this out? No names, but fill it out and hand them in or give them up. Did you all do that? Okay, we'll get to it a little bit later. It has been, I didn't realize it either. Time flies when you're evidently having a good time, because it's been about 6 or 7 years since I've been here, and I thought it was like 3 or 4, but really do appreciate being back. I enjoy coming here. We enjoy meeting with you. And this sort of brings us full circle as far as the first time I came, I talked about just different treatment approaches for dealing with intimate partner violence for both male and female victims and male and female offenders. Second time I came, I talked about the effects on children who are exposed to domestic violence. And sort of today is going to put those together in a different context, one that's really taking a lot of my time in our institute. I've given you a bunch of information and flyers in front of you. It's part of our bodybuilding program, give you stuff to carry around, more weight, build up your muscles, be healthy. So, when they talk about fitness, just say, well, I help contribute to that. Paula mentioned about the 9:30 break. You have to pass a test memorizing all those materials before you're allowed to leave. That's something else we've just incorporated. But a lot of things have changed since I've been here from what we've been doing, and that's what I've given you. The Institute on Violence, Abuse, and Trauma was created when the Family Violence Institute joined with Alliance International University, and that was just happening when I was here last time. And now we're a full-service, comprehensive, one-stop shop resource center. And so you have the orange brochure about that institute. One of the things that wasn't in existence when I was here before is the white flyer that says Professional, Clinical, and Forensic Services. That is the direct services part of our operation. We have 2 full-time doctorate interns, a postdoc fellow, 2 other psychologists. We actually treat the cases that we're talking about here, and we deal with forensic cases nationwide, which means the court cases I'm going to talk to you about. And we've had 2 cases here in Long Beach exactly related to what I'm going to talk about today. So we deal with those cases all over the country. And what also is new is the other white flyer that says NPEIV. I'm hoping you really take a look at that. That's our national effort to end interpersonal violence across the lifespan, and you're all welcome to join. It's a really hefty fee of $25 a year. We actually have action teams. We are working on a national strategy with a concrete task plan to change the way this country deals with domestic violence, child abuse, elder abuse, sexual assault. So I'm sort of tired of saying the same things over the last 30 years. We know a lot more. You all know a lot more than we did, but the country hasn't really made that a national priority. I mean, I just turned on the news here, and you have a local mayor who was killed in a domestic violence situation. I mean, this is absurd. And so it's time to really do something. That only meets once a year. It meets in August now, right before our conference in San Diego, but everything else is done through email and through conference calls. So it doesn't cost you anything. So I'm really hoping you look at that. All you have to do is fill out that last column give me a check or put your credit card information there for $25 a year is all you have to do. And then what action team? And then that'll get passed on to my staff who coordinate this effort nationally. And we have 250 agencies, organizations all over the country now working on this. The think tank we had 2 weeks ago had 115 people representing 190 agencies to really look at how we're going to change the way this country deals with it, including the things I'm going to talk about today. And it has our Hawaii conference, the trauma conference listed. It doesn't have the August one for next year because we haven't made that up yet. Lots of resources for you. And I'm not that far away, so it is a pleasure to come here. The other thing that you can do is join our planning committee for the International Conference on Violence, Abuse, and Trauma. That meets once a month. It plans the large conference, the one we had 2 weeks ago. It's moving to the end of August in San Diego. But you don't have to go far. We actually meet in LA once a month. On a Thursday during lunch, we provide lunch, and it's right up the road in Torrance. So if you're interested in any of those, talk to me afterwards or give me your card. If you want to be on the planning committee that meets once a month, just say PC on it, planning committee, and we meet next week in Torrance at Children's Institute. Lots of ways for you to get involved, not only for what you're doing locally, but also...
It's okay.
Did I say something wrong? You can turn one of them on, just so they don't go to sleep while I'm talking. Yeah, that's good. So anyway, what I'm going to do today is talk to you about how a lot of the other stuff comes together that some of you may already be aware of and some of you may not. One of the things I really like about the program you guys have here in Long Beach is you do have a lot of combination of mental health providers, advocates, and legal people. A lot of the coalitions and people I work with don't have all that, and that's part of what we're going to talk about today. So you have these handouts, by the way, in your packet, most of them. So I'm just going to touch on Children Exposed because I've done that before, and we got, as you see here, there's tons of books. Half the books out here are within the last 2 years. I would say only a fraction were here when I was here 6 years ago. So, and they will move them out there so you're able to move. I have no objection to you looking at them while I'm talking because I'm going to refer to some of them. There's some really great books dealing with trauma for both adults and for children that have all come out in the last year or so. So we're going to talk a little bit of that, but what I want to focus on is child custody issues when there are allegations of domestic violence or child abuse. That's one of the major issues we've been dealing with for quite a few years. And that's an area where, in my personal opinion, a lot of the domestic violence coalitions and shelter programs and family justice centers have sort of fallen down on the job because it overlooks this area, and this is really hurting, especially victims of domestic violence. So I'm going to talk about that. And what set it off is this thing called parental alienation syndrome, which I gave you handouts and talking about the difference here and how to be either you or the people you're dealing with avoiding bias, or to be able to look at reports and situations to know that there may be a problem. And I'm going to talk about finally some turned around cases where a victim of domestic violence lost custody of her children and then at some point gained it back. And that's a new research that's going on now that helps explain how we can do things right the first time. Any of you actually deal with child custody cases directly or indirectly? Oh, okay. All right. How many of you work with domestic violence victims? How about domestic violence offenders? How about children exposed to domestic violence? Okay. How many don't work with any of those groups? You just heard you're going to get out of the sun, there was some food, and you just came in the door. Okay, good. A couple, good. So let's try to talk about that. So first let's talk about child custody. Where this often is a he said, she said. So you have child custody cases by themselves are complicated. And we're going to come back to the survey. You all filled out that questionnaire. We're going to come back and show you what the answers are and why I do that. But first, let's just talk about child custody because as you all know, especially working with victims of domestic violence, the main rule that we've been talking about for decades now is if you're a victim of domestic violence, say something, get out. That's just sort of general terms. And in fact, in the story, and I don't know the details about this local case with the mayor, but one of the things they said is she never reported it to the police, she never told anybody, and so now you see the skepticism that's already saying, well, now that we don't really believe that was domestic violence, so we think she just killed him, and all the other stuff that already happens that you already know about. And that's what one of the key issues is. I'm not exactly clear why throughout the country the issues of child custody with domestic violence hasn't been taken up by the domestic violence coalitions the way they should. It's almost as if once you let somebody know you're a victim, you go to a shelter program, they help you get restraining orders, they help, shelter you and your kids, get you into counseling or whatever. But once the divorce actually moves forward, it's like everybody sort of pulls back. And I never understood exactly why. It's not everybody who does that, but this whole issue hasn't been taken up as a priority by, say, any of the national coalitions against domestic violence and many others. And we started seeing that probably about 15 years ago, and it sort of surprised me, because to me that was an obvious thing. I mean, we're telling especially women, you need to move out of those relationships, you need to get safe, and when they actually do that, after going back and forth maybe 4 or 5 times, then it seems like the resources dry up. And the resource that really seems to dry up is both the mental health and the legal aspect. And that's where they're in most need. So many of the cases we get, the woman might have been in a shelter and now is out of the shelter, has separated from, say, the husband, I'm used the female as the example here, and has actually filed for divorce, or he's filed for divorce before she did. That's the types of cases we're going to talk about today, and what happens in these cases. So, I gave you a couple of handouts similar to the ones I've given you before, but sort of updated on the effects on domestic violence on children. And that's a whole other lecture. I did that probably about 6 years ago. We have a lot more information now about what happens to the brain. And if you want updated time, I'd be glad to come back if my schedule allows and do that again on the new information about the brain and about what happens long term with adverse childhood experiences and other things. So just, whatever my schedule is, I'm glad to do that. But one of the things we do know is that, and the reason this is important now is because many judges do not know this. So, and it was really interesting that Paula mentioned the O.J. Simpson case, because some of you, and I remember that too, because we were working on a national committee at the time that happened. And what was interesting for me is I had people on the same task force I was on nationally who were on both sides of the case, and it drove us crazy. So we had to separate out that case. But you might remember there was 2 parts of that case, right? One part was the criminal, but the other was the family court. And that's what set the legal precedent in California. So that's not that long ago, where the appeals court, because the judge actually gave him custody of the kids and said, well, there's no evidence he ever hit his kids. And we don't deny the domestic violence, but he didn't hit his kids, so we're going to give him custody. And that's where the appellate court actually made a good decision that said, wait a minute, domestic violence by definition means poor parenting. Means you're not considering the needs. If you're beating up the other parent, then you're not taking into account the needs of the children. And that is a very important statement. The problem is it's not enforced. So what we have is many cases where judges and others don't really understand that the kids who are exposed to domestic violence are being traumatized. And that's why we have a lot of new books dealing with trauma and how to treat trauma in kids that are out there. And the key is they are being affected not only psychologically and socially, but neuropsychologically, their brains. So it is important to get them out of that environment and get them safe. And those are the types of cases I end up testifying all over the country. I'm going to New Orleans on Sunday to testify in a case on Monday where the judge has basically not believed that the child was sexually abused or that the mother was a victim of domestic violence, and they go hand in hand, by the way, and has allowed dad to have visitation of his kids with his mother, who doesn't believe any of this, as the supervisor. Doesn't that really make you feel safe for the child? And that's not an unusual case that we have to deal with. So the effects on the kids are important because we have to educate judges. The reason I said there's an overlap is we know, and probably most of you know now, because what's changed over the last 2 decades since I started getting involved in these things, as Paul said decades ago, is the overlap between child abuse and domestic violence. And that's why what really has changed is how many domestic violence coalitions now focus on child abuse and vice versa, because that wasn't that way. When we started our Family Violence and Sexual Assault Institute, which was 30 years ago, we were one of the only ones in the country that integrated child abuse, domestic violence, and sexual assault. Now we see those all over the country, which is good. That's why we now talk about interpersonal violence, because the dynamics are the same, whether we're talking about sexual assault, elder abuse, domestic violence, or child abuse, or teen violence, or bullying. You have the same underlying dynamics of power and control. So the key then, going back, is if you do have domestic violence and are dealing with the cases that you might be dealing with from that standpoint, there's a 50-50 chance there is physical or sexual abuse of the child going on. And for those of you who deal with child abuse, and I don't know, any of you deal with child abuse like CPS or anything like that? Okay, well then it's a 50-50 chance you have domestic violence going on. Doesn't mean it's reported, but it means it's probably going on. So that's where this comes to a head, is in child custody. So we know kids manifest this a whole variety of ways. So I gave you some of those handouts. But the first thing I want to emphasize is definition. Because this is, in my view, the key. And I'm giving you not a legal definition. I'll let Paula and others here deal with the legal part. But from a mental health, social work, advocacy position, the key distinction between aggression and abuse is abuse has the elements of power and control. It's a pattern of behavior where one person is getting their needs met at the expense of the other person. So it implies intimidation, which produces trauma. And that's why we have so many books and so much emphasis on trauma-informed services, to really start focusing on that. Now, aggression is an act, a behavior that could be verbal, physical, or sexual. It may or may not be abusive. So if I disagree with the woman sitting up here and I hit her, there's no doubt that's an aggressive act. But it may not be abusive if we don't have a relationship, if it's a one-time deal, or if there's no power and control issue. Or you can have abuse with physical aggression. Or you can have abuse with verbal aggression and no physical act. Psychological, which we see a lot. So it's important to make that distinction because too many people do not. And we see it in both ways. There's a journal out that I don't want you to get. I gave you 5 of the ones we deal with. But there's one out now, unfortunately, called Partner Abuse. And they have an agenda of showing and publishing things where it's 50% mutual abuse. And will not accept the differences between aggression and abuse. In relationships, research for 20 years has indicated about 40 to 50% of relationships have some act of aggression, where somebody's pushing somebody else, male or female, shoving, grabbing, things like that. But when you move to a definition of abuse like this that you're dealing with, the statistics change dramatically. First, about 70% of the primary aggressors are male. And only about 10 to 15% is it really mutual, where people are fighting for power and control with each other. So it's important because judges and too many mental health evaluators make the assumption that this is Oh, if there's no physical aggression, it's not abuse, and it's mutual. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, but it's a little bit off subject, but the
Yeah.
current national debate regarding regional differences in child abuse, South versus Southern California, whatever, and the switch sticks, etc. I believe, given your definitions, that parents and grandparents that are hitting their children, tearing up their legs, so to speak, they would consider that appropriate aggression, but not abusive.
Yeah, and that's a whole other area that we actually dealt with quite a bit at our conference, which is corporal punishment, and the Adrian Peterson case is bringing that to the national forefront, and it's not going to end quickly. And there's also a lot of cultural issues with corporal punishment, where, in fact, what Adrian Peterson said is, wait a minute, this is not abusive. I was raised that way. I believe that's the way you should discipline a child, and I did nothing wrong. And that is, a percentage of our population who believes that. The problem is with his case, he left major bruises and welts. I mean, he caused major damage because he was using, like you said, a switch. But that's a whole other area. But let's leave that part alone for now, because that argument of discipline versus not and what the motivation is a more complicated one. But I mean, if you really want to get a society that's violence-free, then corporal punishment is not on the list. So that's a separate issue. And we do know, and I hear this, and I'm sure you do, well, that was the way I was disciplined, and I turned out okay. I know none of you have ever heard that. But half the time when people say that, I look at them and I think, I don't think you really did turn out okay. But that's sort of a separate issue, you know? But in any case, it's not ever going to be a one-to-one relationship. But if you have corporal punishment or aggression, and you have attitudes toward power and control, and you add in like the video games and these other things, then you are jumping up your odds of somebody becoming violent, bullying, aggressive.
So I have a situation with a family where there was one time aggressive act, and they were charged with child abuse.
Yeah,
So
now see, remember I said, and I made a distinction between legal and mental health.
Yeah.
So for child abuse, it doesn't have to be a pattern of behavior. I mean, if you haul off and beat up your kid or cause head injuries or do that, that is child abuse. Domestic violence, that is definitely aggressive. It's definitely domestic violence from a legal standpoint. But if you really don't have a pattern of behavior, if you really don't have power and control, then I wouldn't put it in the abuse category the way we think of it. And that's a different situation. Not that it's good. I mean, if I had my way, we'd eliminate all these things. I mean, aggression is not good. And I don't want to say that. In fact, if you have even a woman who's fighting back, then that's still not a healthy approach. And so you have two unhealthy approaches, one just worse than the other. So if we really want to change our society, we've got to do both. I mean, there's so much violence and aggression, but that's a whole other issue. But yes, I wouldn't argue with that. But it's important to know the distinctions here, because I see it from both standpoints. And one of the things that we see really happening now is the verbal and psychological is being overlooked in courts. Because there's so much physical violence in the world, blood and guts, that we just turn on the TV. You see a bomb going off, you see somebody killed, you see all sorts of things going on now all over the world, that we tend to, oh well, so they yell at each other, you know, or he calls her names, big deal. And the problem is, it is a big deal, because we have the evidence now that shows what happens to kids when they are yelled at, put down on a basic high level every day. So that is important. So I gave you that.
Bob?
Yes.
I just want to add, the reason it's difficult to address those issues, the psychological issues in court, is because it takes so much more effort to explain to the court what's been going on. If somebody has a physical injury, you put in a photograph, and one sentence, and it's, you have evidence, it's supported, but to try to begin to explain the psychological damage that's done, it starts to sound petty, it runs for pages. It's very difficult to get that across in a way that is going to be satisfactory as evidence for the court.
And there's we're facing a pretty heavy backlash. It's really sort of a schizophrenic society we're in now. I mean, look at the NFL. I mean, as if this is a surprise to us, right? And I did an interview for some syndicated columnist like a week ago who was saying, is there a connection between traumatic brain injury and aggression?
Yeah.
Duh. It's like, no, you know, why would you think such a thing, you know? And so they got some physician somewhere in the country who said, no, there's no connection between brain injury and aggression. And he was making it simplistic, and I said, no, it doesn't work that way. The parts of the brain that are affected do control inhibitory actions, do control aggressiveness. However, it's a combination of that and the attitudes of the person. It's not if you all of a sudden get a head injury, you become aggressive. No, you may never become aggressive. But if you affect certain areas of the brain and you have attitudes or were raised or you think it's appropriate to use power and control, you just reduce that person's inhibitory controls and makes it more likely they will be aggressive. So they're saying, well, the NFL is no more likely to be aggressive than the population, which is true. However, they do have more head injuries than the population. So for those who get head injuries and have been raised or have the attitudes about violence toward women especially, then you do increase the odds. And there's things you can do about it. But it's like, on one hand, we're saying all this domestic violence, but as soon as you get on the other, like this, the first thing I heard on the news last night with the mayor is, well, you know, we think she's just making it up. And that backlash is strong in both child abuse and domestic violence. And this is like 30 years later. You'd think this is a no-brainer, but we're all still facing that. So this all shows up when we start getting into courts, and especially in family courts. In criminal court, it's not as bad because they're much more trained in dealing with domestic violence. We do have restraining orders, we do have shelters, we do have legal advocates who work in the criminal justice system, but the family courts are a whole different ballgame. And there's very little oversight, unless it's an O.J. Simpson case with high profile. The appellate courts don't pay much attention to family courts. It's a low priority. So what happens is judges get away with a ton of stuff because there's no real oversight. Whereas criminal cases, there's much more oversight. And so one of the things that was in the Leadership Council's website that I'm on their board was starting to realize how often these cases end up where somebody who has been in an abusive relationship and functions really well in the outside world and are doing a good job raising their kids, all of a sudden are losing custody. And as you know, the arguments that we've had for decades is that if a battered woman says or threatens or actually leaves the relationship, what does the perpetrator usually say or do? Right. Well, all right, if you're going to leave, that's fine, but I'm taking the kids. And most of the time, what we've done when we worked in shelter programs and others is say, you know, ignore that. You know, that's not going to happen. But it is happening, and that's what's led to this, is where it's the real double-edged sword. You tell the person to get out of the relationship, file for divorce, they do it, and then they are losing custody of their kids. And that's happening over and over. And I mentioned we had 2 cases here in Long Beach that we dealt with that were exactly like what I'm talking about. And so we're going to keep talking about that. So I'm going to show you a video clip that some of you might remember from 8 years ago. It's showing you a domestic violence situation, not one that's likely to be lethal, but one that is there, and how it affects the kids. We don't see any aggression or violence to the kids, but I want you to look at it in a different way now. I want you to look at this film from a child custody family court situation and assume that sometime after this video she does leave and goes to a shelter and files for divorce. And that's what we're going to focus on, is what happens when she does that. Okay, got the idea? Somebody nod.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. Thank you.
I didn't say to talk, I said just nod. So, can we hit the lights back there and there so we can show this, theoretically speaking? So, obviously you can see the effects on the children, but let's assume for the rest of this presentation that she does go to a shelter, finally, with the kids, and that one of them files for divorce. So that's what we're going to talk about, what happens afterwards, okay? So, I mean, that's a pretty typical example of the domestic violence you're likely dealing with, right? Somebody nod again, just so I can.
Yes.
Okay, good. So there you have the kids who are being affected pretty strongly. So what we're going to focus on now is what happens. So I've given you some handouts on what happens next. Because in that particular example, she never calls the police. They don't talk about it. Like you saw, the next morning, nobody's talking about it, right? Parents aren't talking to each other. They're not talking to the kids. Kids don't talk to each other. It's like the family secret. Again, nobody's talking to each other. And so it is possible that nobody outside the family unit knows what's going on there. Just like the example here now with the mayor. Nobody may have known what was going on. I don't know. But the issue is nobody necessarily knows. No police reports. If she's going in like for the bruise you saw, she's probably making up some other excuse of how she got it. So there's not going to be a lot of corroboration. So they go to a shelter, and then let's say she files a restraining order that may or may not get granted. And at some point it gets into family court. Either he or she files for divorce. The likelihood now is that both are going to file for custody of the kids. And if she has an attorney or somebody who knows what they're doing, they're likely to say they want supervised visitation of him until he gets treatment for his domestic violence. Okay, California, along with many other states, have good statutes on the books. For example, it says in California that if there is indeed child abuse or domestic violence, then the person who's committing that should not get sole or joint custody of the kids, and in fact needs to have treatment for the domestic violence or child abuse. And it's what's called a rebuttable presumption, meaning that if a judge is going to award sole or joint custody to that person, they have to actually on the record explain why they're not following what's normal. In other words, normal meaning not. Now that's what's on the books. So there's two little caveats there that nobody really realized when those laws were passed, because those are good laws. In fact, we were part of the national group that recommended that, along with the Psychological Association, the Social Work Association, the ABA, the AMA, all the national organizations recommended that. And many states have that. But enforcing it's a whole different ballgame. So the caveat that you have to watch is most of these laws say a finding of domestic violence. And sometimes they put length of time, like within the last 5 years. How many of you deal in one way or another or have with family courts? Okay, so these types of cases can go on for 5 years with temporary orders after temporary orders, and by the time you get to an actual trial, it may not be 5 years. So then the argument is there's no domestic violence in the last 5 years. Well, that's because they weren't together in the last 5 years. But the issues are still there. The power and control, the intimidation, the trauma. So part of that is then we say judges don't have to have a rebuttable presumption because they don't find that there is domestic violence. And some of them say that. So as soon as there is no finding of domestic violence, then there is no actual rebuttable presumption. And we see more and more judges who aren't trained who don't find domestic violence, quote unquote. Now, if a criminal court actually finds it, then that counts also. But think about what happens. You file for a restraining order and it gets granted. That is not considered a finding. Because a judge is granting the restraining order, but unless the judge actually states something like, I find that domestic violence has occurred, and therefore I'm granting the restraining order, it doesn't count for the family court. And in fact, we have family court judges who ignore some of the criminal court findings. And the other thing, and that's why I like what you're doing, and hopefully you'll keep doing it, is there's not a lot of attorneys in this state or around the country who know how to deal with these cases. Just like there's not a lot of mental health professionals who actually understand who are doing child custody. We're in a continual battle nationwide now, our group and others, dealing with custody evaluators who are not trained in domestic violence or child abuse, but are taking on these cases. Those are the two I had here in Long Beach. One was a family court services person who actually had no training in domestic violence and recommended that the father have custody, and he was given custody temporarily. And then she found us and an attorney who understood, and we went back in and did the evaluation, and that was one of these, what we called at the end, I'll tell you about, turned around cases, where she ended up getting custody back, but it took 4 years. And it turned out that family court evaluator wasn't even licensed and misrepresented her credentials to the court. And she was paid by the county, I guess. Long Beach is county of LA, right? And I don't know whatever happened to her, but and the other was mental health evaluators. And so we're going to talk about those issues because this is affecting you. It's affecting you because a lot of times we don't follow these cases over time. They've gone in our shelter, or they've gone to advocacy or gone to counseling, and we don't see the aftermath of what happens as they go through the family court system. And so I gave you a variety of handouts, what happens in family court, and the reasons that a variety of us have talked about, including Peter Jaffe, who you just saw on the tape, of why people fail to recognize domestic violence and how it gets sort of minimized. So you have the victim herself or himself who minimizes it. Then you have society that's minimizing it, and then you could have a judge or evaluator who's minimizing it. So by the time you get through all those minimizations, it's like it didn't exist. And so it's being ignored. Keep in mind the other thing going on in courts is the presumption of joint custody. So family courts require judges to pretty well give joint custody, again, unless there's a reason not to. Domestic violence and child abuse is a reason not to. But if you don't find domestic violence, then you get to ignore that. So that's why this is really important. So that's why I've given you a whole bunch of materials here from a variety of people, both legal and mental health, looking at what happens in these cases and why so many battered women are losing custody of their kids nationwide. It's what has now been called the family court crisis. And so Joan Meyer, who's an attorney who works for DV Leap, founded it, has done a lot of excellent writing. We work with her pretty regularly. I, and Lenore Walker did a presentation about 3 months ago to the American Bar Association and the American Psychological Association on exactly these issues of what's happening with domestic violence and child maltreatment in family courts and the ethical issues involved. So, and one of the other things you see in one of the flyers you have there is that we've taken over the Journal of Child Custody. That was a journal I actually founded about 10 years ago, appointed another editor, and it was set up to really focus on these issues and to be a counter and really looking at what the science says, and it moved in the wrong direction in my opinion, so the publisher turned it back over to us this year. So we created a new editorial board, and we're now moving on these issues to counter all the myths and all the bad information that's been published. So this is some of these handouts looking at these things. And what some of the studies are showing now, and this is the part you should be scared about, with all the work you're doing and have done to get help for victims of domestic violence, to get them to get empowered, to get them out of those relationships, or to treat the offenders so they change their attitudes, beliefs, and behaviors, which is all good. The cases that don't get that way, and it does get into family court, it is much more likely that a perpetrator of domestic violence or child abuse is going to end up with sole or joint custody of the kids, with no order that they required to get treatment for dealing with the domestic violence or child abuse, because they're not finding that. And part of the reason they're not finding this and why I'm doing this presentation is people in my field, meaning mental health, These are most of the custody evaluators are people who are social workers or MFTs or psychologists who are not trained in these issues that you are trained in and are going into court basically recommending custody to the perpetrator because she's made it up, it's not real, she's exaggerating, it didn't affect the kids, and all sorts of different other excuses. That's who I'm countering. What our institute does is we tend to evaluate evaluators. Somebody around the country thinking somebody screwed up, they'll send the case to us. We don't get simple cases. We only get the complicated ones. And most of the time we're coming in after the fact to try to undo the damage that was already done.
On the television, they always ask the children.
That's true, but that's television. Well, now you got to also watch. You just actually did something that you got to be really careful about. You tried to use logic. Yeah, you got to watch that. You know, that's a dangerous thing. Yeah. But you know, it's humorous because that's sort of obvious, isn't it? Yeah. Like in the film, who are the witnesses? So the obvious conclusion is if you're evaluating this case, talk to the kids. Well, I'm here to tell you that there is a national organization that's the main one for custody evaluators who are training their custody evaluators not to ask the kids the questions because it'll traumatize the kids.
And that message has leaked definitely across to the courts. The judges feel very strongly that they shouldn't be requiring one child to testify, a child to testify for one parent and against the other parent. So they'll do almost anything to keep that testimony.
And I'm not agreeing or disagreeing with that part. I think testifying is traumatic, and a lot of kids will recant and do stuff because it's very traumatizing. But for evaluators in our profession to come in, we can ask the questions in non-traumatizing ways. In fact, we train custody evaluators on how to do it. Things like, oh, what does mom do when she gets mad? What does dad do when he gets mad? When dad loses it, what happens? When mom loses it? Kids are not going to all of a sudden get more traumatized than what you saw in that film. By asking those, we're not asking them, do they love one parent or the other? We're not asking who they want to live with, even though they may volunteer that. But the kids can tell you what's going on in their families. They've witnessed this. You saw the kids at the top of the stairs at the start of that film. If you don't ask them, we already know they're not going to volunteer the information, either the victim or the kids.
When you talk about custody evaluators, you're talking about...
Yes. Go ahead. We'll see if my answer's right.
Are you talking about therapists that are providing the treatment that are licensed, or people that are authorized forensic professionals?
Yeah, the latter. So in California, for example, there are custody evaluators have to meet various requirements that are actually pretty good on paper. They have to have 40 hours of training, and we do the training, by the way, in issues dealing with child custody. They have to have 12 hours of training in domestic violence, and they have to have 8 hours training in child abuse, child sexual abuse.
They're not forensic professionals.
Well, they're supposed to be. Now, there's a real debate that I don't have time to deal with now on what you should be doing as a custody evaluator forensically versus therapeutically. And that's actually an article that Toby Kleinman has submitted that will be published later this year, because there's a whole nother debate going on now where this organization has come out with guidelines that says if you're doing therapy with a court-ordered case, let's say these kids have been referred to you for therapy, as the judge did that. Well, they're now saying, well, you can't follow therapeutic guidelines, you have to follow forensic guidelines. Well, the forensic guidelines mean you're not an advocate, you're a neutral fact finder. That means you can't support the kids, you can't validate their experiences, you can't do what's ethically required as a therapist. And that actually cost the psychologist her license, because she followed therapeutic guidelines and they took away in New Jersey, and that case is being appealed. So we're talking about some serious issues. But the custody evaluators are ones who are designated by the courts to actually be evaluated. It means they've supposedly gone through those requirements and they take annual updates, 8 hours. The problem we're having is who's teaching them these courses.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
It's not, they're not up to date.
And I've testified against the people who are training these others. So they say, yes, I got my 8 hours of training by John Smith over there. And John Smith is not trained in domestic violence. John Smith went to a workshop. And now he's doing it. And I've seen the handouts. They even give wrong statistics. So it's really become a dangerous issue. So what you see happening here is that the perpetrator's getting custody. And it becomes a real resource issue. In other words, who has the money to hire the experts and the attorneys who know what they're doing, and who is going to have the money? Is it the victim who's going to have the money? 9 times out of 10, no. And I've dealt with some of the 10% cases, and that hasn't gone well. We have a major case in Texas, $2 million case. I mean, that's how much it costs for family court. Experts all over. And I just heard, despite all the evidence, that the jury gave him custody, and I have no idea why. And we had detailed disclosures of the kids of sexual abuse. So this is a real issue. So that's why I've given you a lot of these things that have come out, so that you have them as resources as well. And some of the things that are in one of the manuals we did on what is emotional abuse and what is sexual abuse, because those are key questions now. We're finally getting a little bit more tuned into sexual assault, especially with the military now. And now you have in the state the first time, yes, has to actually be overt when people are having sex. And there's all sorts of jokes about that, but the notion is sexual assault is real. Teen dating, violence, acquaintance rape are real. But the last thing people tend to ask victims of domestic violence is about sex. And that's, again, the least and last likely thing they're going to volunteer, is to tell you what they did that was so humiliating, what he made her do that she was not comfortable doing. And if we don't ask, they don't tell, which is what causes most of their trauma, is the forced sex or the actual forced rape. And so if you don't ask, that never comes out in court. And that's a key, again, is going back and knowing how to ask. So that's why I give you so many of these things. You already know about power and control, but a lot of courts don't. The criminal courts now have been educated, but not family. So when I go in and we talk about economic abuse or intimidation or emotional abuse, they're ignoring that. So I have to actually show them, and we have the research now, that what do those things do to the kids and their brains. And some judges are finally paying attention to that. So we're trying to work with the National Council of Juvenile and Family Court Judges, who have come out with really good materials. If you go to their website, they have 3 booklets that you can download, and we try to give those to judges, because it's really good on domestic violence, on child abuse, and about the myth of parental alienation syndrome. So some judges pay attention, some don't. But the more we can educate, the better off we are. Consequences to the victim. Pretend that woman you just saw is in court. Now, is she going to look like a good witness? No, she's not in good shape. She's been traumatized herself. She probably has PTSD from however many years of the verbal and physical abuse. And he's going to look cool, calm, and collected, like you already know. So family courts, they look at him, he's stable, he has a good job. He's, really interested in the kids. Kids do love him. And she looks like she's a mess. In fact, she might be, on antidepressants. And I always look at that. That's a good thing. Why is that a bad thing? But they use it up. And you know what the red flag for me is in these court cases? Is the labeling. It's really nice to know all these perpetrators have become psychologists, because they're quoting DSM-4 and 5. Oh yeah, she's histrionic. She's borderline. You know, they got all these labels. As soon as I see somebody say that, that's a red flag for me. The sad part is the mental health evaluators are buying into that if they're not trained. They're not looking at the power and control. They don't even understand power and control. That's what separates out people like you and people who are trained versus the people who are doing the work, who don't understand about power and control and intimidation. That's the bottom line that a good evaluator needs to be able to find out by talking to the kids, talking to the parents, looking at corroboration, and it isn't being done. Dan Saunders is a really good guy. He's a social worker in Michigan. Got funding from the National Institute of Pardon? Yeah, what did I say?
University of Michigan.
Yeah.
Yay.
Oh. I thought I said something wrong. And he got funding from the National Institute of Justice to look at, because of the family court crisis, to look at attitudes of judges, mental health professionals, and others. Major study over 2 years. We're publishing part of it. But I gave you this in your handouts, the actual website, if you want to go to it. It's scary. And one of my former students who's now got her doctorate is, we're going to have a special issue coming out in the Journal of Child Custody on attitudes of child custody evaluators, because we've got several people around the country who have done research now looking at domestic violence, child abuse. And one of the things they found, and this was a survey of 1,000 custody evaluators, judges, advocates, mental health professionals, and others. And what they found is that first they believe there is a hierarchy, and that's okay, and that victims make false allegations, they alienate their children, but rarely do fathers make false allegations of abuse. That's what they believe. These are the people making the decisions. And this is a new study, this isn't old. That's scary. And the Leslie Sanders, who did her dissertation on that under me, found with qualitative interviews of custody evaluators the same thing. They believe that women are exaggerating and making these up to gain advantage, and that men rarely do that. People want to just leave or keep going, or what?
This is an real long degree.
Yeah, all of you, good. Mutual, they disagree, they argue a lot. What that implies is first mutual. So, and it minimizes abuse. Obviously, all abuse cases are high conflict. It's a no-brainer. But when you use the word high conflict instead of abuse when it's abuse, that's a problem. And that's what we see happening over and over by judges and untrained custody evaluators, is they use the term, it's just a high conflict situation. And then that's where trouble starts. So that's why I gave you this difference between high conflict people and high conflict situations. So it's important to watch the terminology that's being used. I also wanted to show you this. We're going to have a special issue in the journal next year on what I'm calling the myth of the Johnson typology. And I don't know how many of you know about research or publications, but the general notion is when you do a research study and you find something that's significant, it gets published. However, if you do a research study and you don't find anything of significance, it tends not to get published. So what happens, and it's happened actually with Neil Jacobson's research about 15 years ago, and they used to have cobras and pit bulls, and I forgot what his labels were, but he did a research study and he found some differences physiologically between offenders and victims and published it. And he published more articles than he had subjects and things like that. But people kept trying to do that and not finding what he did, and it never got published. So that one article stayed in publication until finally somebody replicated Amy Holdsworth Monroe exactly and couldn't find what he did, which meant his was really idiosyncratic findings. It wasn't the real case. Well, Johnson, and how many of you have heard of Johnson's typology? Okay, two of you. Well, that's not surprising, because people in the domestic violence field have no idea about this, because it wasn't meant for the people in the domestic violence field. In fact, Holdsworth Monroe, Hamburger, Saunders, Dutton, a variety of people that you probably have heard about did do typologies and have found that there are different typologies of domestic violence offenders. But Johnson's stuff was used in custody cases. It was theoretically derived, and he has this thing I gave you. And the thing that's dangerous is right here. And this is what we see in court cases. This is what's been promoted by the AFCC, Association for Family and Conciliatory Courts. It's called situational couple violence. How many of you heard that? That's what's going on in family courts. It's not a big deal. It's a situational couple violence, which means, well, because they were in a divorce or they were but it's not a big deal, so we don't have to pay attention to it, so we don't have to go along with rebuttable presumption. Now, do any of you know a case of domestic violence that didn't occur in a situation? Or not with a couple? It's like, that's absurd. It is all situational. It's all related between partners. And so this has no meaning. But what they're trying to do is separate out what they call intimate terrorism, which means severe physical abuse. And that's the only thing that counts. And if you know the statistics, only about 20% of the cases are going to fit over here. Most of them are going to be over here. So they're using that in court cases to minimize domestic violence. And it turns out we've had people in 3 different countries try to replicate, and nobody has been able to. So we're actually going to be publishing a whole issue on the failure of this to be an adequate model of typologies. In fact, his own statistics don't fit. But that's what's being used. And I never heard of it for years because I know the domestic violence literature and the books that we have here, and it's never in any of those. It's all in the other literature. It's in the marriage and family literature, and it's in the custody literature. So, and it's never been validated. Everybody assumes it's been validated, and they go from there. So keep in mind. Some of the books that I wanted to just remind you, you saw Peter Jaffe. This is a great book. It's called Protecting Children from Domestic Violence, Strategies for Community Intervention. That's one of the ones that deals with this. If you want to know more about the kids and the brain and all that, there's a couple of these we brought called The Cost of Child Maltreatment, Who Pays, We All Do, that Chris Franey and myself did, and it has 2 great chapters in there, one by Bessel van der Kolk and one by Bruce Perry, looking at the neuroarchaeology of trauma on kids and what it does to their brain. So some of the things to keep in mind. So I wanted to give you this, so at least if you hear about it, you can counter it. All right, I already give you that. Now, did you all give me your quizzes? You should have them in your packets. If not, don't put your name, do it. Fill it out quickly. Just circle the correct numbers, or what you think are the correct numbers. I will tell you why you're wrong. All right, so. Anybody? Yeah.
Because it seems hard to really go back to
Some of those I've given you in there. The others I can. If you email me, like especially the ones on parental alienation syndrome, you've got a bunch of references in there. The stuff on Johnson is in there. Dan Saunders is in there. You actually have the website to go to. Some of the others, if like on when we talk about here, if you email me and you have my email on the front, I can just say, can you send me the references for the child abuse or stuff, and I can send it. Yeah, no problem. All right, anybody else want to turn that in real quick before I tell you what the answers are? You did it or not did it? No. Oh, but you can do it real quick, circle. Yeah, so a couple of you circle that and then you can pass them in. No names, just do them real quick. Okay, so how many of you said the percentage of child abuse cases substantiated or founding? How many said 10%? 20%? 35%? 70%? 85%? Okay, the answer to that is about 35%. This is national. Now that's changed. 15 years ago when I did the training, it used to be 50%, that's why it's not up there. But because of the complication and CPS and younger kids, they're finding less and less substantiation. So 35% is about right.
My experience tells me that that's too high. That's way too high.
Oh, 35% are substantiated?
When we're working out in the community, we know that these cases repeatedly are unfounded. We report hundreds and hundreds of cases.
You're talking about are unfounded or are
unsubstantiated,
noted as
unfounded.
Yeah, now there's 2 different things here. First there's reported, second is what somebody finds, and third is what actually happens.
Isn't that what you're talking about?
Yeah, so substantiated means that they were found. So national statistics by CPS and the NIJ comes to about 35%. Yeah.
I don't believe that.
Well, yeah, nationally. Now, that doesn't mean you're, and this is about right, by the way, according to research too. If you're finding significantly less, then that may be a problem. That means,
It is a problem.
yeah.
It's easier for them to unsubstantiate.
Oh, that's the whole thing. Well, let's not argue about that first. Let me just tell you what the research shows. Then we can argue later. Okay. Second is, what percentage of divorce cases have child abuse? How many said 10%? 20%? 35%? 70%? 85%? Okay, and you're a relatively trained audience, and you're not even coming close. That's not good. 10%? No. Yes! You're trying to say no now. No, okay, good, you did that right. Now, you know why. First, this is divorce. Tons of divorce cases don't even have kids. Others get settled, they agree, don't even dispute it. So that's why we think a lot of this is disputed. But only about 10% actually have allegations. Now, what percent of custody cases have allegations? 10%, 20%, 35%, 50%, 75%. Okay. 20%, 20%. And you're not alone. And that's why I do this. And you have this survey in your handouts too, by the way, on your PowerPoint. It turns out that those are the toughest cases, those are the ones we remember, and we think it's all over the place. But when you actually count up, like if you went to your Long Beach court and pulled out at random 1,000 cases of custody, only about 20% would have allegations. And that's what people have done. And I've had judges who say, oh no, when I train judges, that's not, almost all my cases. Well, I say, okay, for the next 2 weeks, you count. Because they forget all the cases they sign off on, all the cases that, there's no argument, and all these others that are, the parents agree on how to deal with custody, or that they're dealing with financial or other matters. Then we get down here, what percent of child abuse cases in disputed custody, disputed divorce are found in substantiated according to research studies? How many said 10, 20, 35, 50, 75? Okay, a lot of you abstained it. No guts anymore, huh? If you said 35 or 50, I would give you credit. Because it used to be 50, it's dropping a bit. The reason it's dropping is because this is dropping. But it turns out that it's about the same percentage whether it's a divorce or not a divorce. And I put a caveat there. You see this right here? According to research or somebody actually investigating. If you just rely on CPS reports, they get what you got, which is down here. And that's part of the argument too, is they're not founding it. They're not. And in fact, the reason I do this, and when I train CPS and others, I do this too. I do this survey for judges, and that's why I had you do it. All sorts of different groups. Most of them get these things wrong because that's the myth. The myth is that these are rampant in divorce cases and they're all false. And it turns out they're no more false than others. And this, again, there's a whole list of research. I gave you some. This is the national statistics looking at CPS around the country. The problem is now we have more and more in this category. When there's a third category that's allowed, and some states don't allow it, that's what's showing up. Where there are red flags, looks like something's going on, but we can't really prove it. Now, that doesn't mean it's false, it doesn't mean it's true. It could go either direction over time. But the statistics here have not changed in decades. And I gave you some of those references in there too. False. Think about it. And that's why I spend so much time in training getting you to think about definitions. Because people jump to conclusions. And your job is to educate your colleagues. False means Somebody said something that they knew was untrue. That's what false means. Look it up in Webster's. Somebody lied. So a child lied, said I was abused and they weren't. Or a parent said my child was abused and they knew they weren't. That's a false allegation. That's different from misperceived. Daddy hurt me down there. Whoops, sexual abuse. Well, maybe, maybe not. And if it wasn't because it was just hygiene issues or others, that's a misperception. It's not false. It's not like they knew that it didn't occur. When you look at false allegations, there is no study anywhere in this world that has ever found more than 12%. Nowhere. And I gave you some studies in Canada and other places as well. But these are questions that we train people to look at when they're dealing with these cases. Like, who's the primary aggressor? Are there false allegations? These are all things that you can start paying attention to. And so one of the things that we see happening is misinterpreting unsubstantiated to mean false. And that's a key, because most of the time it doesn't mean, it means either we don't know or misperception. And that's a different connotation. So are allegations of abuse rampant in divorce? Are most allegations? So I gave you now a whole bunch of references and issues and what to look at in these cases. Because what's going on in these cases is what Kathleen Fowler calls overvaluing the coaching hypothesis. So we don't want to say that the kids have made this up. So who's the culprit? Mom. Mom programmed the kids. Mom coached the kids to say this. Case after case we deal with, that's the argument. That's where parental alienation syndrome supposedly comes from. There's this condition that doesn't exist, by the way, so I gave you a lot of those handouts, of a parent alienating the child against the other. Now, how many of you dealt one way or another with a divorce case? Okay. Usually parents who are in the middle of a divorce are not overly fond of the other parent. I know that comes as a real shock to you. So slipping out, negative comments about the other parent happens. Some parents actually try to turn the kids against the other parent. So alienation can happen. But this syndrome doesn't exist. And logic, remember I yelled at you for using logic? Logic goes out the window. It's crazy about this. And so that's what Kathleen says. Studies have shown over and over, and that's why this new book that just came out called The Witchcraft Narrative by Ross Chait. He was one of our keynote speakers a few weeks ago at our conference. He goes back and looks at all the suggestibility research. And the notion is that kids are suggestible. Do you know, how many of you heard of suggestibility and that idea? Coaching, all that. Okay, so a lot more of you. There is no research study that's ever been done anywhere in this world that has ever found under any condition that even half the kids or adults were suggestible. Did you know that? The ones that have been found, it's like 20% or 30%. And to get up higher, it took coercion. It took somebody the kids trusted telling them over and over, yeah, remember when you were lost in the mall? Remember when you spilled the punch bowl? Remember this? And finally they would say, oh yeah, I remember that. But there's never been even a majority of people who have bought that. And kids can be suggested, young kids, on peripheral details, but not the main details. And none of these have anything to do with child abuse, especially sexual abuse, where a child's telling you about what was done to their body. But we think it is. And that's where logic has gone out the window. It's called, so somehow it's easy to coach kids. And the two examples is, how many of you have been, are, and are willing to admit that you were a parent at some time or are? Okay? All right. So you guys are relatively trained, right? Social work, mental health, counseling, you have some training. So I assume you're all perfect parents. Your kids do everything that you tell them without any problem at all. Because you know how to coach them. You know how to condition them. No big deal. Parenting, you can ignore all the parenting books over there because it's an easy thing to do. That's what the assumption is here. Right? So the example I give is my own daughter. Well, it's not only mine, Alan's had a little to do with it too. Who's now a 36-year-old social worker in Texas. We tried, with all my years of experience as a psychologist, and I know a lot about coaching and conditioning and that. I don't know as much as the CIA or Secret Service. Well, I'm not sure how much they know anymore, but in any case, I don't know, but I know a lot. And for 18 years, we tried every technique known to human psychology to get her to make her bed and clean her room. Token systems, conditioning, threats, you name it. She's a 36-year-old social worker who still doesn't make her bed and clean her room, which drives her husband crazy. So it's his problem now, not ours, so that's okay. Coaching is not an easy thing to do, especially to get a child to make up allegations about domestic violence or child abuse about a parent they love. That's where logic has gone out the window. And what we try to do with these judges is bring it back, because they just assume, oh yeah, she's coached. And that comes up over and over in these cases. And it's a no-win situation for the domestic violence victims. Because when you look at the actual behaviors, they don't match. And so you need to actually look at every case. You need to actually investigate. And that's where CPS falls apart. All over this country. Because as soon as they hear it's a custody case, they don't do what they normally should do. Now, I'm being general. It's not every CPS investigator. But by and large, that's been a major problem in the cases we've had to deal with, is that it's in the record, custody case, and then you look, they never bother to watch the videos of their own forensic interviews. They already concluded. This big case we dealt with, the first time they had a disclosure by a child, in the records, the sheriff's office said, contentious child custody case. Well, it wasn't even contentious, it wasn't even a child custody case at that point. Dad said that, but there was nothing even filed in the courts. And that once it got in the record, it got there everything for the next 4 years. Nobody bothered to pay attention to what the kids were saying. And every time the kids disclosed, mom's visitation got cut more and more, which is the theory behind parental alienation syndrome. That's why it's so dangerous. It got thrown out by the American Psychiatric Association in DSM-5. They waged a huge campaign to get this as a diagnosis. And the American Psychiatric Association a year and a half ago actually did a press release saying, well, I'll paraphrase, this is garbage. That was my paraphrase, they didn't say that. They said there's no research, they said there's no support. They said we're not even listing it as a future issue because there's nothing here. The 500 articles have been published were not peer-reviewed research. And if you want to know more, I can give you references in our Journal of Child Sexual Abuse from 2 years ago. So this whole thing is getting thrown out. So this is what you have with the women you're dealing with. It says, well, thank God we all made it out in time. Of course, now we're equally screwed. Because we're telling them to get out, we're telling them to be safe, we're telling them to file for custody, and they're losing their kids. The cases we've dealt with, some of them haven't seen their kids, and they were the primary caretakers. They haven't seen them for 4, 5, and 6 years. So it's serious issues. Or they're being restricted. Because somebody in my field recommended custody to the perpetrator saying there was no perpetration. Never having looked at any of these details. Never really evaluated. So you wanted the references, I've given you a whole ton here. Go back 20 years looking at the statistics from starting in 1990, going all the way through this century in different countries. So I gave you some of these and you have the references. Yeah?
Listening to you, to be honest,
No, I don't want you to be honest. Forget honesty. Go ahead.
It feels like an environment of mistrust of the entire legal system, and
From me?
if a woman has a valid concern, the worst thing you can do right now is report it, because you're just the system's gonna beat you up, chew you up, and spit you out. So what do you do? It's leaving.
So the question is, what do you do? Well, in part, that's correct. And in fact, I don't say that though. But it is a real difficulty. There are attorneys now, when a woman says, by the way, I was a victim of domestic violence, where attorneys are telling them, don't say it because of this. If you say it, you're going to lose custody. And if you don't say it, you're going to end up with, it's like a no-win situation.
Is that our experience here?
Yes. In some cases, it's just easier not to go there and just accept that it's going to be joint legal and fight for the timeshare.
Really?
Because a lot of the guys use the court system to perpetrate the abuse of the power and control, and they want to win. And sometimes what they want is to win on paper. It gives them a lower child support order, and then they back off. So sometimes strategically, it's just like, let's go for joint legal, let's get a parenting schedule that favors mom, and he'll be happy because he's got something on paper and he's got a reduced child support order. And sometimes we tell our clients, I hope he finds a new girlfriend, and they'll leave you alone.
And sometimes then once they get that, they don't actually pay attention to the kids because they never did before. So, but the first thing is, now see, I coached her to say all that.
And she is challenged.
But that's the thing, is that people, when I do this, they said, oh, come on, you're exaggerating. You should see the cases we get in our office. To tell you how bad it is, and it's not every case, obviously, but when we bring in our doctorate students, our new interns and postdocs, the first thing I do is I train them on what they're about to see. Because when they read these reports, and some of them are 200 pages, it's absurd, by a mental health evaluator who is licensed and may have been in practice for 30 years. And what they read there is absurd garbage. I mean, she was telling me about an example she had where some evaluator gave MMPIs, same as we get. The MMPIs are almost identical, but in the report, he's in good shape and she's in trouble. And those are the cases. And I have to train our people on worrying about transference and countertransference, because they're wondering how these people ever got licensed. I mean, that's how bad it is. So, I mean, I can be exaggerating, but I wish I was. And you just heard the types of cases we're dealing with, one after another, and it's everywhere. Whether it's San Diego, or Tennessee, or Florida, or Arizona, we have cases all over the country. Hawaii, and it is a problem, and that's why you're better off at least being aware. Now, I don't have the answer about what you were saying, which is a real problem, but attorneys are telling, like Paula said, well, don't bring it up because they're going to end up going the other way. And I see some of these cases when a woman will call me and say, I think I'm in trouble, and she'll tell me her history, and I say, yep, I can see the handwriting on the wall. They're priming for taking away custody from her. And unless she has an attorney like Paula, or like people who are really trained, they don't know how to deal with these people. They don't know how to bring in people like me and others like me who know how to challenge them and do this stuff and look at the testing. And they don't have the resources. That's been the problem. What I'm hoping, and we've been trying to get a grant, is to pair with like some legal people, and you guys have a good shot because you all combine, but to actually take on some of these cases pro bono. And we do some of that, but I mean, we don't have the resources. But to actually be able to give them the mental health resources that they need, and train the attorneys. We have to get to the law schools, because they're only, in this state, I only know a handful of attorneys who are really trained on how to deal with PAS and all this stuff. And they get overwhelmed by the high-powered attorneys that the perpetrator hires, who are very aggressive, by the way. So I gave you a whole bunch of these things just so you know, and you don't think I'm making all of the statistics up. So you do have the references here. And some of them that we published too, like Trochme, Nick Bala and Nico Trocme have done some of the greatest work in Canada because they had access to court records throughout their country, so thousands and thousands of cases. And they've been able to track what these levels are. And that's why I gave this to you. And you have the reference here of one of them that was published in Child Abuse and Neglect. There's another one we published in our Journal of Child Sexual Abuse. So you get some of this. So going back to the film you saw. So when you watch that film, it's clear she's a victim of domestic violence. It's clear these kids have been exposed to it, right? I mean, you don't have any doubt. But until the NSA gets their way, we don't have cameras in people's homes. Maybe next year. But it's a he said, she said, with no corroboration unless you get to the kids. And that's the problem. Now let's make the case more complicated. So she's now filed for divorce, and she's asked for custody, and she said, you know, she's a victim of domestic violence. And he's filing for custody saying she's crazy. She's mentally unstable. She stays home from work for no reason. She's on antidepressant medication. She's hysterical at times. She overreacts. She's a lousy parent to the kids.
You're the one writing all those declarations I read.
And she does all that, right? Yeah. And she may or may not have an attorney who knows how to fight it. And there's no corroboration. Nobody outside her family knows. Oh, well, she's told her mother. Now, how much credibility are they going to pay attention to her mother? You're saying yet, or you want to make
No,
a...
I want to complicate it even more.
Yeah, I was going
Let's say, can an attorney advise a child to record it on cell phone?
It's interesting about the laws of that.
What?
No, in California, both parties have to consent to a recording to be admissible, except if a judge finds domestic violence, it only takes one party. But they have to find the domestic violence first.
Has to be there.
So what, you know, there's an interesting case. She was at our conference. I don't know how many of you know who Crystal Harris is or was. She's a woman who was a victim of domestic violence in San Diego. And she was in the process of separating from her husband. And he's been terrorizing her. So she turned on a recorder in the drawer when he came over, and just in the you know, in the room, in the bedroom. And he started yelling at her and screaming at her, which is what he's been doing. But then he raped her. I mean, forced, coerced, and raped. And she was screaming, "Don't do that! Don't do that!" Kids are downstairs, and it all got picked up on the recorder. And so she filed for divorce, and she had the recording. They admitted the recording because it was not set up for that reason. It was like what they call spontaneous utterance. So they allowed the recording into family court and criminal. He said, no, that's the way we have sex. And he was not convicted of rape. He was convicted of, I think, sodomy or something else. But rape is a felony conviction that, you know, puts you away for anywhere from 15, and the other is not. And so he actually got sentenced to 7 years. He was convicted, but he wouldn't have been without the tape. But what was interesting is what then happened in family court. In family court, she was a higher breadwinner, and even though they agreed she was raped in family court, she was required to pay his attorney's fees. And the kids who've been exposed to all this were required to have visitation as soon as he got out of jail, despite the recommendation of the therapist of the kids. And she had resources, so she appealed it. And it changed the laws in California. So the laws in California now say you cannot end up being awarded fees if you were convicted of sexual assault or rape or domestic violence, and that it does affect child custody. And the appellate court overturned the judge's ruling, and the legislature passed a new law. But that's the way it was until a couple years ago, even in California, and we're considered a more progressive state.
What that law is?
Still not refined.
No, but it's, if you search Crystal Harris, it'll tell you, because there's Crystal Harris. Or email us. I mean, she was at our conference this year. So, but the key is going back into these situations. The evidence, the corroboration is really hard to find. And so that's what's causing a lot of these problems. So in that case I gave you, we can make it more complicated. So we got them, he said, she said, filing for custody. Sometimes you get an evaluator who doesn't know what they're doing. They may say, well, he's more stable. We don't find any domestic violence, or it's situational, or recommend custody to him, or they get joint or something. But let's make it more complicated. Remember, we said at the beginning, the statistics says about 50% of cases where you have domestic violence, you have child abuse, physical or sexual. So, let's say, remember the middle girl in the film? The one who spaces out and all that? So, mom goes to a shelter, kids go to the shelter, dad's out of the home, they're separated finally, kids are in therapy, and middle child discloses, Dad touches me at night when I'm in bed sleeping. And therapist reports it to CPS. Now, theoretically, CPS should do a forensic interview or send it to the advocacy center. Sometimes they do, sometimes they don't. But in most of those cases, given the history I just mentioned, the mother's going to be accused of programming the kids. Parental alienation syndrome, coaching. But we know from the research, and I gave you some handouts, what is the likely reason this child has now disclosed when never had said anything before?
Safe.
Yeah, safe. Finally getting therapy, she's out of the home. The odds are more than 50-50 that if she's actually giving you detailed disclosure that it occurred. Because you see the false allegation statistics. But that's not the way it works in family court. And if she discloses, it's going to be used against mom. Just the opposite of what logic tells you. That's why I gave you all these things. And so you can look at this and have these. Saul Gothard, who was an appellate court judge in Louisiana who dealt with this, and a social worker. This is a great statement that I gave you. And I gave you the research why you might have disclosures after separation. Kathleen Fowler has done good research. And I gave you a whole bunch of stuff about the myth of parental alienation syndrome versus parental alienation. So and here's your references. The more you know about this, the more you take it seriously, the more you can help the people you deal with, the more you can educate your attorneys, the more you can educate the judges. Because you don't want to see all your work going to waste. Where all the advocacy, all the therapy, all the stuff you're doing, and then a perpetrator without treatment gets custody of the kids. Because that continues the cycle of abuse. So that's why I gave you all this information. And you should read this. How many of you have heard of Richard Gardner or parental alienation syndrome? A few of you. Just so you don't think I'm making a lot of this up or I'm exaggerating, because it sounds so absurd, right? Read what's quotes right out of his books. They're self-published books. And so I gave you those, so you can read what he actually says, or said before he suicided about 4 years ago. So, and this is exactly what's going on. And he has clones all over the country. So that now they don't use PAS. They say alienation and they follow his guidelines. First rule of thumb when you have alienation, separate the child from the alienator who is mom, even if she's been primary caretaker. How many of you understand trauma and have had some training on trauma? Okay. How many of you know a little bit about child development and attachment? Okay. Everything you know about trauma or child abuse goes out the window with this. And that's why I brought lots of books. Tima, who's up the road here at Pepperdine, Thriving in the Wake of Trauma, a multicultural guide. She is great. She was at our conference. Healing the Trauma of Domestic Violence, a workbook for women. There's a couple books that are actually cases with mental health professionals. This is From Madness to Mutiny, Why Mothers Are Running from the Family Courts and What Can Be Done. There's about 3 of those there. And the other one that Oliver Williams did, which is great, Parenting by Men Who Batter. And how do you actually change attitudes, beliefs, and behavior. Lots of resources. But don't take my word. Read the quotes. And then look at the cases you're dealing with. Because preparation education is the way to stop this cycle. And this is what's supposed to happen. And when I have more time and I do full trainings, I actually show some videos of Gardner saying these things. This is his recommendation. By the way, so if you have a problem, the woman only has to become more sexually responsive to her husband and that'll solve the problem.
Isn't that terrible?
I couldn't make this stuff up. We have to just help them understand that society doesn't approve of sexual offending and incest. Doesn't mean it's a bad thing. Societies do that all the time. I mean, this is his view. Was sexist. Wow. Why would you say such a thing?
How did he get away with it? That's what I want.
Because he was a well-respected child psychiatrist who did a lot of good work on divorce until one day in 1988 he decided this. And he published it and it sounded really good. People would rather believe coaching or lying or things like that than that so many kids are being sexually abused. It is always interesting to look at the disconnect if you think about it yourself. There's no argument by any statistics or people that we have a minimum of 55 million people in this country who are victims of child abuse. But they all skip childhood, by the way, because none of those in childhood ever are actually victims of child sexual abuse. They just went from birth to adult survivors, skipping the process. Because if you look at the substantiation rates, you look at what's reported, you look at custody cases, you don't come near the millions of kids that have to end up being abused to end up with 55 million. And by the way, nobody is disputing. In fact, if anything, that's a conservative figure of adult survivors of child abuse. And there's a whole body of research on adverse childhood experiences that I don't have time to tell you now that really looks at what the effects of this are.
You got 10 minutes.
Well, you can say a lot in 10 minutes, go.
This is one of those pamphlets from the National Council of Juvenile and Family Court Judges. So I've given you a lot of stuff we do with judges, some of the articles, some of the training we do. Last month was in Louisiana training all their judges on dealing with the dynamics of this. The problem we have is the abuse disclosures get disqualified because, well, the child ran up to dad and gave him a big hug. Well, they wouldn't have done that. They had no training on child abuse. Overvaluing experts with no clinical background or knowledge about child abuse or domestic violence who are involved in these cases. That's what I'm having to deal with. This is a direct quote. I'm not an expert in sexual abuse or domestic violence, never treated any such clients, in fact not licensed, but I am an expert on false allegations of abuse. She gets $10,000 a case to testify. Every case is a false allegation. And she's one of the people now being referred to have misrepresented her own research in Ross Scheidt's book, The Witchcraft Narrative, by the way.
So what happens to those cases that she's...
Well, if they have experts who know how to challenge her, and I've challenged her in 2 cases, and luckily the judge didn't pay attention to her, but she's been very powerful in the East Coast in these cases. So I've given you things from other books on how to look at what are the risks to kids. Some of these you probably know, but I wanted you to at least have them. This is what Peter Jaffe and I actually put together, that if there is indeed domestic violence, how you need to switch the custody cases. So it's not joint custody and equal share, it's protecting the children and the victim, and how to look at that. So I've given you that as well. This is one of the things that I modified from the California Protective Parents Association. They've done a good job of looking at protective parents and looking at how do you tell if an evaluator. So these are questions that I agree with, that an evaluator should be asked before you agree to having them evaluate your case. And I have other things on how you review the credentials. And I tell judges, if you're not sure, send me their CV and I'll be glad to give you an opinion, and I won't charge. It's just part of our services. To make sure the people who are getting involved in doing these cases are really trained, because too many of them are not. They'll go to a workshop like this and then they say they're now trained. And looking at various guides to risk. So I gave you a bunch of resources. Some of this might not be as helpful for you directly, especially if you're not involved, but hopefully it'll be helpful for you to work with your clients so that when they are looking at a court-ordered evaluation or something, they know what to look at. Because the more knowledge, the more empowered they are, the more likely it is it'll be done correctly. So these are all guides to assessing risk to children from batterers. This is an actual case. Joy Silberg, who does a lot of this work, she and I do a lot of collaboration. These are terms we see in these types of cases. I didn't give you some of the quotes, but I gave you, I don't remember which ones I've given you. This is actually a case. What she has, this is what the evaluator said, is an encapsulated delusion. She functions really well in every area except where it comes to her delusional belief system that her child has been abused. This is a surgeon, by the way, who does surgeries on a daily basis and does fine, but somehow she's histrionic and not a fit parent when she deals with her parenting because her child has disclosed sexual abuse. And so a psychiatrist, 3 psychologists, a social worker, and CPS all shared this encapsulated delusion because they actually substantiated her report. But Dad got custody because the evaluator said this and the judge went along with it. So how do you have good case outcomes? Amy Newstein and Ann Getting actually published this a while back, looking at cases where it comes out good to begin with, and this is some of the things they look at. That's why training and education is the key. And I gave you a bunch of incorrect assumptions that found in Saunders' research, Sanders' research, and others. They don't see a connection between IPV and parenting and all these other things. So I gave you this, and I gave you what Joy and I put together is the 10 most common mistakes that we find custody evaluators doing in these cases of domestic violence or child abuse. So you have them there that you can look at. And suggestions, things that we deal with on a daily basis. And then I wanted to show you this, because this is, you don't have this, but this is downright, this is a simpler type of case. In this case, we did the evaluation, judge was biased. It looked like the children had been sexually abused as well as domestic violence. And I just want you to see some quotes here. This is the day after the dad got custody of the kids, and mom, who had been primary caretaker, lost custody. And so the judge gave dad full control over visitation. So this is what he said. You will have a 3-hour visit with the boys every Wednesday. A worker from Family Place will supervise it. You will bear all the costs. If the below are not met, either in their time or whatever, all these other conditions, you lose visitation. You will begin psychotherapy at least weekly for 8 weeks, no less than 6 months. You can choose your own therapist. Isn't that nice? However, I must endorse your choice. After your first meeting, I will meet with the therapist to discuss your issues, and you'll pay for all this. If you miss an appointment, you miss your next visitation. By the way, you notice any kind of control issues? Yeah. Just a little bit. This is actually, these are quotes. You must work 80 hours every 2 weeks and earn $14 an hour. You can't be self-employed, employed by your family, or employed by anybody who worked on your case. And it goes on. If you don't, you lose visitation. You can't file any motions against my attorneys, appeal it, my experts, or anybody else. If you do, you don't have visitation. If you file a complaint against any of the people involved in my case, you lose visitation. It keeps going like that. And in fact, she hadn't seen her 2 kids that she raised who didn't want to be with him, who were afraid of him. And I heard one ended up in drugs. I don't know what happened to the other. And I just wanted to give you this. These are called turned around cases. And I gave you these at the end. This is research that Joy and Joan Meyer and others are doing. It's halfway through. We'll be publishing that probably next year, because I don't think we have it yet. But it's basically looking at a judge or a case where custody went joint or sole to the perpetrator, and then at some point later reverted back to the protective parent, and the kids were protected. And their research question is, what led to that? And so it gives you some of the statistics, talks about what happened to these cases. The part I want, and you can look at all that, but I want you to look at first what happened in time 1 was the mother in these cases, almost always the mother, couple of fathers, lost either all or most of the contact with the kid. In other words, visitation was either taken away or supervised. And then at some point later, they got it back, and there was no contact with the perpetrator. Some of them end up in criminal case. But I want you to look at this. How long it took. The average of this was 4.5 years. Some of these went, in one of the cases we had, went 9 years before she finally got custody of her daughter back. Of these, about 7 or 8 of these are our cases, of these 27. So I gave you all these, and so you'll have that. And then I gave you at the end some of the different things we're doing that are resources for you. And I will end with 30 seconds to spare. On the act of love is to say, I want you to be who you are. The act of abuse is to say, I want you to be who I want you to be. It's that simple. So hopefully this gives you some information that you hadn't thought about. Issues that you can start helping your client and attorneys and judges to be educated. And I'll be outside because they're supposed to empty this room. I'll stick around. The books will be out there. Feel free to buy one of each so that my poor wife doesn't have to carry them all the way back to San Diego. Thank you for listening.